first just asking us to think for a minute about the specific topic of this half-day meeting, namely obsolete laws. Now, obsolete laws are a category of bad or imperfect law. Certainly not the totality. Some laws are just poorly conceived from the start. They don't require a day to be wrong-headed. They're wrong-headed from birth. But other laws, and I take it this is the focus of what we're talking about, make sense at one point in time, but cease to make sense at a different point in time. And that raises the question, well, what is it that renders law obsolete? If we understand that, we'll have a clue about how we need to respond to this phenomenon. Well, just off the top of my head, here are 4 answers to that question. I'm sure there are others. The first is the growth of human knowledge. We may believe at one point in time that a certain substance is safe for human consumption, and at a subsequent point in time, we discover pretty conclusively that it isn't. Okay, and our structure of law and regulation needs to adjust to that, and the slower it is to adjust, the more out of date the original law/regulation becomes. The second factor, which is particularly pertinent today, I think, is economic, technological, and social change. And I could give hundreds of examples, but in the interest of time, I won't. This is one of the things that makes the regulation of the burgeoning information technology sector so very difficult, that the pace of change outruns by an order of magnitude or 2 the pace of legislation and regulation. The third factor that renders law obsolete is the phenomenon of globalization. Globalization renders a lot of law and regulation obsolete by providing new opportunities for exit from the purview of law and regulation that didn't exist previously. And once the exit option opens up, then law and regulation needs to be able to take that into account. And fourth and finally, a particular passion of mine, the growth of political polarization, because processes for generating law and regulation that make perfectly good sense during periods of consensual politics break down almost entirely during epochs of polarized politics, and I thought Congressman Cooper was particularly eloquent on that point. So with those 4 factors in mind, and Phil and others to taste, we can then proceed to ask the question, well, why do we have so many obsolete laws, regulations, and procedures anyway? I'm not going to try to quantify it. I'm not going to try to say whether we're better or worse than our major developed country peers and competitors, but clearly there is a problem here. And once again, I will offer 4 hypotheses very quickly. First of all, we have a constitutional system whose primary purpose is the avoidance of tyranny. Tyranny by any concentrated power, and the unintended consequence of that is the tyranny of the status quo. Second, and Congressman Cooper again was eloquent on this point, the incentives are perverse. There are incentives to produce law and regulation, but very much weaker incentives, if any, to try to eliminate or prune away. Third, and this is where I think proposals like mandatory sunset laws may have an important role, there's a lack of enabling structures, particularly in the legislature, for pruning and weeding. But fourth, and I would just want to spend a minute on this as I wend my way towards my conclusion, our current regulatory strategy is designed to produce obsolete regulation. And let me try to explain what I mean by that. Let me begin with a general proposition. The more law or regulation focuses on the specification of means to ends, as opposed to the identification of the ends themselves, that is to say, the more regulations are what Philip Howard called rules-based as opposed to principle-based, the more likely they are to obsolesce. Because broad purposes like like protecting human beings from harmful pollutants, don't change, but the means to abate those nuisances will change quite quickly. That raises my final question in this regress towards the ground. Why do we have so much rules-based regulation as opposed to principle-based regulation? I see John Kaminsky in the audience, and this very question was at the heart of the Vice President Gore's famous National Performance Review, aka Reinventing Government. Back there we called it, back then we distinguished between steering and rowing, but the idea was exactly the same. The point of governance is to steer. It is not to try to row the boat. There are plenty of people who want to row the boat, and the only question is one of general direction. So, to repeat, why do we have so much rules-based as opposed to principle-based regulation? And I will conclude with a point of history and a point of current analysis. As an historical matter, we are now functioning within a post-New Deal legislative paradigm where the Congress crafts general, aka vague and imprecise laws. They are then parsed and implemented through regulation, and we have proliferated agencies to craft these regulations and to enforce them. But, and this is my peroration, there is constant pressure for ever more precise rules. Why is that? This, it seems to me, gets us to the heart of the matter. Philip Howard talks about the need for discretionary authority. The simple fact of the matter is that today there is intense fear of discretionary authority, the fear that it will be abused without a check. Secondly, there is acute mistrust of regulated entities. The thesis is that corporations in particular will try to take advantage of every opportunity they have to evade the intended force or purpose of the regulation. And the only way you can pull against that is by creating a box with no escape hatches, right? Ever more detailed regulation. The third, and this is particularly characteristic of agencies and also of the Congress of the United States itself, the fear of being blamed for the mistakes that occur 1 or 2% of the time. You can make great congressional hearings and agency show trials out of the 1 or 2% mistakes. And as long as we have a system that's driven more by the mistakes than by the generality of successes, we have a structural bias towards ever more precise rules. And finally, there is, I think, with the rise of our modern judicial state, which parallels the growth of the modern regulatory state, an effort to make sure that individuals who have been harmed have precise grounds for legal redress of the harm and compensation for it. And the more precise rules are, the better suited they are to the legal process of alleging violations of rules and gaining compensation for people who allegedly have been harmed by the violation of the rules. So I think we really need to think very hard about the following conundrum. And that is, as I said, the more regulations are rules-based as opposed to principle-based, the more likely they are to become obsolescent. But the pressures for rules-based as opposed to principle-based regulation are intense, and up to this point, nobody has figured out a systemic way of resisting those pressures. Thank you.